Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. This podcast will be a continuation of the previous one, but along a slightly different line. Again, I will be addressing the subjects of ontological idealism and ontological realism, but here I will be talking exclusively about Marxism. And so the attempt will be to explain how ontological idealism and realism relate to the ideas of Marx and Engels, and how they have been developed subsequently by other Marxists leading up until the present time. So, Marx and Engels, as I mentioned before, were strong opponents of ontological idealism. And again, that is most clearly demonstrated in the book by Engels, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. With that book, there was a break by Marx and Engels, specifically Engels, with the idealism which had dominated German thought since the time of Immanuel Kant. And that was a very significant break. And there were some people, obviously, who were fans of what Marx and Engels were doing, and others who were very strong opponents. Now, the way in which Marx and Engels made that break was not to entirely reject Hegel. For example, Marx, before he was a Marxist, or the founder of Marxism or scientific socialism, was a member of the young Hegelians. They were literally young people who followed the ideas of Hegel. And Marx continued, even after leaving the young Hegelians, to accept the idea of the dialectic, which was developed by Hegel and previously by Fichte. So the dialectic was not abandoned by Marx and Engels, but it was taken in a new direction. The basis for that new direction was the work of the German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach. Ludwig Feuerbach was a German materialist philosopher. By definition, as a materialist, he was also an opponent of idealism. And so he was a very convenient companion to Marx and Engels as they developed their approach to scientific socialism. So basically, as Marx said, he took Hegel and turned him upside down on his head. What he meant by that, I think, is that he accepted, again, the dialectic from Hegel, but by turning him upside down on his head, in other words, he rejected Hegel's idealism and replaced it with Feuerbach's materialism, which is a type of realism, the reality of materiality. If you are a materialist, then by definition, you are a realist. Now, there are other types of realism too. We will get to that in a bit, but materialism is one type, and it is the primary type that was embraced by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Okay, so Engels, in particular, explained the break with Hegel. And that is in a book I mentioned in the previous podcast, Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. In that book, he basically said that the world is not made by ideas. In other words, he rejected idealism. The world is made by people and matter. And so the relations of production, the economic powers and forces in the world were the basis of the materialism that was used by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So that was not a component of the materialism of Feuerbach. So Marx and Engels were not limited by Feuerbach, but they used him as a route to overcome the limitations in Hegelianism and embark on a new journey toward materialism. That was basically what they did. So that was a major shift in Germany. And it wasn't only Marx and Engels. Again, it was also Feuerbach. But German philosophy had been dominated since the time of Immanuel Kant by idealism. So proposing something else was, I guess you could say, revolutionary, but revolutionary really more in terms of ideas than in terms of action. The ideas that were proposed by Marx and Engels were very much unlike anything that had been previously developed in German thought. And that is what made their contributions to German thought extremely fascinating. And even people who disagreed with them were really impelled to study what they wrote, because not to do so would basically be a failure to keep up with the times. Sadly, as the 19th century drew to an end, and first Marx and then Engels died, in the 20th century, there was an entirely new shift in Marxism, if you could even call it Marxism. And some people have even resisted using the term Marxism or scientific socialism to describe that shift that happens in the 20th century. I am not that much of a fanatic. I am willing to call it Marxism or whatever anybody else wants to call it, but I will simply say that the kind of Marxism that was developed in the West in the 20th century was very, very different from what Marx and Engels had done. So, just as Marx and Engels had turned Hegel upside down on his head, the Western Marxists turned Marx and Engels upside down on their heads. In effect, they developed variations of what is sometimes called Hegelian Marxism, meaning they attempted a fusion of Marxism with various types of idealism. Many people objected to it, but over time, that became the dominant approach to Marxism in the Western world. And it was again, a lot of people challenged it, but their challenges were largely unsuccessful, at least throughout most of the 20th century. The Western Marxists were successful. Basically, they staged a coup and they overthrew the work that Marx and Engels had done. I don't know why, but for some reason, they were inspired to return to a kind of German idealism. But since they also liked Marxism, they simply fused that German idealism with many of the ideas of Marx and Engels. So that's the problem. Throughout the 20th century, most Marxists were not really realists or materialists. They were instead idealists. The best example of Western Marxism is perhaps the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, sometimes called critical social theory, to distinguish it from another type of critical theory that we will talk about in a moment. The Frankfurt School of Critical Theory was developed by various scholars, philosophers, sociologists, political scientists, economists, and so on, who worked at the Frankfurt School of Social Research, obviously in Frankfurt, Germany. When Hitler was rising to power, when World War II was starting, those critical theorists were impelled, maybe compelled, to leave Germany and find protection someplace else. The majority of them came to the US, and in particular to New York City, where they stayed for the duration of World War II. Now, that was not true of all of them. Herbert Marcuse instead went to Waltham, Massachusetts, where he became a professor at Brandeis University, a really nice university, which I visited one time when I was looking at different places to get my Ph.D. I ended up not going to Brandeis, but the place was beautiful. It's a beautiful campus, but it's also quite cold in the winter, and the cold really does not agree that much with me personally. Okay, now when World War II was over, most of the critical theorists from the Frankfurt School went back to Germany, except for Marcuse. So Marcuse was an exception at the beginning and at the end. He did not go to New York, and he stayed in Massachusetts after World War II, where he was an extremely popular professor. I have had friends who had Marcuse as their professor, and I have discussed him with them, and all of them loved him. He was apparently a very eloquent man. He would explain his ideas very well and very clearly. But many people have regarded him, as well as the other critical theorists, and more broadly, the other Western Marxists, as people who basically abandoned Marxism and went back to a kind of Hegelianism. And I think that that critique has merit. In fact, I am inclined to accept it, at least to a degree. I am not as convinced enough to reject these people as having been Marxists altogether. I think that would be too much of a stretch. Some people have said that. I will not. I will not go that far. But I will say that they certainly turned Marxism into something that was quite different from the Marxism or scientific socialism of Marx and Engels. Okay, so that's one type of critical theory. I said that I would mention the other type, and here it is. This is a critical theory which has no relationship, no historical relationship to the Frankfurt School at all. The similarity in names is purely a coincidence. It's called critical theory, but it's not related to the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. Instead, this second critical theory developed in the field of literary criticism. And it was basically based upon the ideas of Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. In other words, what is commonly referred to as post-structuralism. Now, Foucault was originally a Marxist, in case you didn't know that, but he left Marxism to develop his own approach. He actually went back to his original books and edited them, produced new editions of those books, which were devoid of the Marxist terminology and the Marxist ideas to fit with his new philosophy, which is perfectly legitimate. There's nothing wrong with doing that. I think it was a shame. I wish that Foucault had remained a Marxist and had not become a post-structuralist, but that was his choice, not mine. Foucault and Derrida both despised the term post-structuralism. Maybe they would have preferred the term literary criticism. I don't know. But they did not like the term post-structuralism at all. But regardless, that is the term which stuck. And so we are left with the term post-structuralism. That's what it is known as. More recently, in the last several decades, there has been a dialogue between members of these two critical theories. And so there has not exactly been a merging between them. That would be an overstatement. But what has happened is that increasingly members of these two critical theories have begun working with one another and borrowing from each other's ideas. And so in some respects now, it is kind of accurate to only talk about one critical theory, which was formed out of two other critical theories which had no historical relationship to one another. That can be debated, but regardless, there are those two different critical theories, and I think that should be pointed out. However, it is only the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, which was a part of Western Marxism. And again, it represented, in a sense, a return to Hegelianism and idealism, meaning the idea that somehow Marxists should look at our minds and our ideas, and they tried to place human activity into the context of awareness. That's not anything that relates to what Marx and Engels did themselves, but many Western Marxists took precisely that course. In other words, they basically moved away from Marxism, at least as Marxism was conceived by Marx and Engels, and developed something new. Now, what happened? Okay, I'm happy you asked that question. Beginning in the late 20th century, Roy Bhaskar, who we've talked about numerous times in this series of podcasts, began something which has become known as critical realism. Personally, I think that term is unfortunate because there are many different critical realisms. So referring to it as critical realism could lead one to confuse it with any one of a number of other critical realisms, which also have no historical relationship with one another. Let me give you one example. Bhaskarian critical realism, the critical realism of Roy Bhaskar, is perhaps one of the two major or most widely used versions of critical realism. The second is called theological critical realism. And if you want to know about it, I suggest you get a subscription to Zygon magazine, because many of the articles in Zygon are written by theological critical realists. So what has been happening is a dialogue, literally, between people from those two different critical realists. That strikes me personally as a bit odd. Here's why: because critical realists who are connected with Roy Bhaskar's ideas are generally Marxists. Not all of us are, but we should be. Roy Bhaskar was certainly a Marxist. There have been some. There was one critical realist that I read about. I actually read some of his work. He was actually an objectivist, a follower of the ideas of Ayn Rand. I mean, how much further to the right can you go? Somehow this guy claimed to find a way to reconcile the critical realism of Roy Bhaskar with Ayn Rand's objectivism. Do I think he did a good job? No, but but he got his stuff published, and in academia, that's what matters. His stuff was published in peer-reviewed journals, and so I guess he made a name for himself on some scale. There are also some critical realists connected with Roy Bhaskar who are really more in the line of being social democrats or progressives. I would not exactly call them Marxists. So there's some variation, in other words, between people who refer to themselves as Bhaskarian critical realists. In fact, there are many people who say, well, yeah, I'm a critical realist, but I'm not Bhaskarian, which is confusing in itself because, yes, they are Bhaskarian. What they mean is they are Bhaskarian critical realists, but they are trying to move away from the ideas of Roy Bhaskar. Because if you say you're a critical realist, but not Bhaskarian, that means the logical question is, well, are you a theological critical realist or a proponent of one of any of several dozen other unrelated critical realisms? So I wish people would not say that, but unfortunately they do. All right. What Roy Bhaskar did, in my opinion, he rescued Marxism. He rescued Marxism from Western Marxism and the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. He brought Marxism back into an alignment with the ideas of Karl Marx. That is especially true in his early work. His early work is called critical realism, followed by dialectical critical realism. Both of those turns of critical realism are very clearly Marxist. But then there were two further turns, which are referred to more broadly as a part of Roy Bhaskar's spiritual turn, which began after Roy took a trip to India and met with many Hindu gurus, proponents of various Hindu philosophies, especially the philosophy of Advaita or non-duality. And Roy Bhaskar began to consider himself a follower of Shankara, who was basically the founder of Advaita, which I think is untrue. Roy Bhaskar was not an Advaitist, but he regarded himself as one, I think incorrectly, but I have discussed that in previous podcasts, so there's no need to go over that territory once again. Following transcendental dialectical critical realism, the first part of Roy's spiritual turn, Roy developed the philosophy of meta-reality. Now, to understand the relationship between these two, and there is a relationship, although they are not the same, transcendental dialectical critical realism is, in a sense, a continuation of dialectical critical realism with a spiritual element added to it. But you can also say that it represents the epistemological aspect of Roy Bhaskar's spiritual turn. In other words, perception, how we perceive reality and spiritual reality. So, one example which I think I've mentioned before, but I'll mention it again because it is rather odd. It is very odd, is that in one of his books on transcendental dialectical critical realism, Roy spends an extensive amount of space on his own incarnations. Maybe you should say reincarnations, but whatever. And he describes his past lives in extensive detail, where they lived, their occupations. As I read through that book, I kept on wondering, where is Roy getting this information from? Did he go to a hypnotist and have some kind of past life regression? Did he get it from his dreams? I know Roy did practice transcendental meditation, but past life regression is not a part of TM or transcendental meditation per se, so that would not really fit that well with TM. So honestly, I don't know where he got that information from. Maybe he had visions. Again, I don't know. But regardless, that was an epistemological phase or turn of Roy Bhaskar's critical realism, where he explored ways in which we can perceive reality, not only material reality, which is the reality that was dealt with by Marx and Engels, but spiritual reality as well. But again, the focus is on perception, which is what epistemology is. Then, as Roy progressed in his thinking, he developed a new approach, which he said was the final stage of critical realism. Whether it would have been that, nobody can know. It is very common for scholars to say, this is the culmination of my work until tomorrow. Tomorrow comes along and it's no longer the culmination of that person's work. So we have no way of knowing what Roy would have done had he lived longer than he did. Roy had a very painful death. I was unaware, as I think most people in North America were unaware of the suffering that Roy was going through. But when I found out, I felt really, really bad for him because I felt like I had a very close kinship with Roy Bhaskar, even though I never actually met him face to face. I did have an opportunity, but I passed it up because I did not like the conference that he was going to. I discussed Ken Wilber's integral theory in the last podcast. This was an integral theory conference. That is why I did not want to go. But in retrospect, I deeply regret that. Okay, so the philosophy of meta-reality. The second part of Roy's spiritual turn and the final turn of Roy's critical realism. This is the ontological part of Roy's spiritual turn. Here, Roy explains the different levels of development that we can go through as human beings. He gets into enormous detail about what these levels are. I will put a link to my current book on critical realism, where you can get some idea of Roy's work. You will also, however, maybe unfortunately, be reading about my own ideas because I intermix my ideas with the ideas of Roy Bhaskar. What I am trying to do, whether successfully or not, is to continue Roy's work. A lot of critical realists are doing exactly that. I wish Roy were still around. I think especially with the world situation as it exists right now, especially with the Israeli terrorist campaign in Gaza. Roy is needed. Roy's perspective is needed. Whether people would listen to him, I doubt it, because people didn't listen to him when he was alive, except other critical realists. But still, at least for me, and I think for other critical realists, his presence in the world right now would be of benefit to me, and I think to other critical realists as well, and hopefully to people who are not critical realists. If Roy would have developed an approach to understanding the situation in Gaza based on critical realism or meta-reality, that would be even better. And that might have drawn additional people to his philosophy. But again, his focus in the philosophy of meta-reality is on developing a kind of spiritual ontology. Ontology meaning the study of existence and being. Who are we? Who are we? What are we? What do we consist of? Now, do I agree with everything that Roy says in his philosophy of meta-reality? As I have said before, no. Most of it, but not all of it. I mentioned previously that I changed Roy's cosmic envelope into the cosmic interior, which is one of the central aspects of the philosophy of meta-reality. In doing so, I placed spirituality on the inside rather than on the outside. To Roy, spirituality was the outside of existence. So we are literally moving outward. And the further we move outward, the more spiritual we become. But I think that's incorrect. I think that there is a spiritual interior. And the deeper we go into that interior, the more spiritual we become. Because of Roy's cosmic envelope, placing spirituality as the envelope, as the exterior, many people accused Roy of abandoning critical realism and developing a kind of, for lack of a better term, critical idealism. Do I agree with that? Yes. Yes. I think that's exactly what Roy did. I think that was a mistake. Personally, I don't know. This is only my guess. I attribute that mistake to Roy's declining health. And I don't think that he was thinking as clearly in the aughts as he was prior to the aughts. Because I have watched videos of his on YouTube, which you can too, and his talking looked like it was painful. He was struggling to get his words out. So I really think that he literally lost his ability to think clearly about things in a critical, realist way. And so he reverted, maybe partially based on his interest in the Advaita of Shankara, to a kind of idealism. And I don't deny that. I think that's what he did. Now, could anything have been done to change it? No, I don't think so. I mean, if somebody is alive, a writer, the writer has authority to say what she or he wants to say. But I think that people like myself and others who are critical realists, who are still around, can do the work, or at least some of the work, which may be necessary to make, I feel bad about saying corrections, but I'll say it anyway, corrections to Roy's philosophy of meta-reality, to bring it back into correspondence with the rest of critical realism. So that basically concludes what I wanted to say, essentially, that Marx and Engels began having Marx having abandoned the young Hegelians, being influenced by Ludwig Feuerbach, developing a kind of materialism throughout the 19th century until both of them died toward the end of that century. Then during the 20th century, the rise of Western Marxism, including the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, much of which, not all of which, but much of which was idealistic. And then Roy, beginning in the late 20th century and continuing through the aughts of the 21st century, trying to reverse that trend and to put Marxism back onto a realistic track. However, I should add, with some reluctance, that because of Roy's spiritual turn, he did lose many people. There were many critical realists who strongly objected to the spiritual turn. They felt that Roy was no longer a Marxist. I think that's really incorrect. Roy had developed a new form of Marxism, a spiritualized form of Marxism, but he had not abandoned either Marxism or Marxism-Leninism. He stated in one of his earlier books his support for the Soviet Union and his support for Fidel Castro, which, as far as I know, makes him a Marxist-Leninist. But he never actually called himself that, but that's the only thing I have to go on. And so Roy Bhaskar should be remembered for his work both in developing the Marxism of Marx and Engels, and also for expanding it into territory that was not explored by Marx and Engels, namely spirituality, the philosophy of meta-reality, and transcendental dialectical critical realism. This has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.